S. Connolly, also known as Stephanie, is a best-selling and award-winning author, alchemist, and sorceress. She has been practicing and studying all things occult and metaphysical since 1984. Her interest started with divination, gematria, and necromancy. It quickly spiraled toward ceremonial magic, witchcraft, and Daemons. She has been practicing Demonolatry since 1988. Stephanie's Amazon book list contains over 50 titles on Demonolatry. She also writes occult and paranormal mystery novels as Audrey Brice. She writes BDSM, erotic romance, and horror as Anne O'Connell, and she writes general fiction, fantasy fiction, and paranormal fiction as S.J. Reisner. Overall, she has written and published over 150 titles. And without further ado, S. Connolly. Stephanie, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
I've really looked forward to this. I am a big fan of yours. I love your books. I know my viewers love them as well. Your name comes up a lot during discussions. First of all, how long have you been writing?
Well, let's just say that writing was a totally separate interest of mine, as opposed to like the occult and all of that. That was a separate interest, and they kind of grew separately. I've been writing probably since I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I used to write little short stories. So I started out as a fiction writer and as a novelist. So it just kind of, as I got older, it kind of combined with my love for the demonic and magic and all of that.
So how long have you been on the left-hand path?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it depends on which aspect of the esoteric you're talking about. I began seeing and speaking with spirits when I was really young, probably about 3 or 4. I mean, I don't remember a time that I didn't see and speak with spirits. So that was always like something that was going on with me. I started questioning questioning my spiritual beliefs when I was probably about 8 years old. And that was due to, listening to my aunt talk about her religion. Her and my mom would have these long discussions. And I was like one of those kids who liked to hang out with the adults and not the other kids. So I would sit there and listen to them and get involved in their conversations instead, because that was just far more interesting to me. And so when I was like 8 or so, I did some experimenting and got some ideas in my head. And by the time I was 12, the neighbor lady, that summer that I turned 12, the neighbor lady started taking us to the public library. And I found myself checking out books about, witchcraft and demonology. And it just kind of spiraled from there. So I would say, started practicing when I was 12 back in 1984. So as of next year, it'll be 40 years that I've been actually a practicing magician.
So how did you come to be on the left-hand path? How did it all begin?
Well, it started because I wanted to know why I could see and speak with spirits and nobody else could. And then I kind of got into the whole Christian Satanism when I was young. That's where I started, was the Christian Satanism. Like, oh, the hell mythology is real and the Christian mythology is real. And then by the time I was 16, because I didn't really understand what I was doing, I don't think. I read the Satanic Bible, and that kind of really made me look at the Christian mythology and say, this is all just a bunch of BS, and because it's taken from older religions. This is all just stolen from everybody else. And at that point, I ended up meeting some people at a party because, of course, again, I hung out with people who were much older than me. I always have. So I was 16 at a college party, and I ran into some people who called themselves Demonolators. I didn't know what that was until I was 16. And we got to talking, and they were like, well, you can join our study group. We won't initiate you or anything like that, but you can join our study groups. They happen every weekend, and you're welcome to come along and learn what we're all about. And, and I was like, well, no, that sounds great. And so I was doing that for probably 2 years before I finally initiated as a Daemonolatress. And so, yeah, it was a long pre-initiate training, like 2 years of pre-initiate. But even during that time, I still took classes in like witchcraft down at the local. Once I was able to drive, I could go down to the witchcraft stores in Denver because I was all the way out east. I mean, there are different groups of occultists in Denver, and I happened to be with a much more philosophical, mature crowd of occultists, as opposed to, because there were a lot of other groups too. There were, oh gosh, what's the name of that group? Temple of the Psychic Youth, Toby. They were really big out here back then, and there were a lot of Wiccans, and then of course you had like your street kids who were kind of down in Denver doing their thing. And I wasn't part of any of those groups. I definitely hung out with a much older crowd. So, yeah, that's kind of where it happened, and kind of where the shift happened was when I was 16. Because before then, it was just like, oh, screw God, hail Satan. It was very, I don't know. It's like where a lot of people start. That's where they start because they're rebelling against the cultural norms, and then you discover that there's more to it than that, and it's what goes a lot deeper, and it's not as superficial as that.
That's a good point. Many times people do start the journey just going totally opposite and being rebellious. And then, like you say, it leads to more. So
if you think about it, back then we didn't have like the internet, right? We didn't have any of that. So like we had to go to the library, and then you were limited by what your public library had, or the bookshops that you were able to get to actually had in stock. So this was still right before like the Llewellyn book, book bloom or whatever, and before Samuel Weiser and all of those other big publishers started just flooding the market with books about witchcraft and alternative spirituality. So, and even by the time I was in my 20s, when I first wrote Modern Demonolatry back in 98, 99, when I was first working on that, there still wasn't a lot about left-hand path. I mean, I think that the closest thing we got was maybe Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft and a few small books like that, everybody, well, I don't even think Richard Cavendish's book was out by then. But, Arthur Edward Waite's book of Black Magick, that was another one that was available. So those were like the only things you had to draw from. So you didn't know that there was another way, So, I mean, that's when I was between 12 and 16, that was what I was drawing from. Right. Black masses and all that stuff, because that's all I had. I didn't have anything else. So when you don't know that anything else exists, it makes it really, you're just kind of winging it at that point.
Absolutely. My viewers are across the left-hand path spectrum. Do you mind explaining what Demonolatry is?
Demonolatry is basically the worship of demons or the divine intelligence. And when we look at what is actually demonic, the origins of the word are basically divine intelligences replete with wisdom. Basically, they're more like universal intelligences that encompass ideas and elements, the elements of our creation, and thoughts, feelings, that sort of thing. So people are like, oh, but so you're saying that everything's an archetype. Well, maybe, but I think each of those things has its own intelligent force behind it. Kind of like, we talk about the planetary intelligences and spirits that associated with that. The same thing is with demons. Like demons, divine intelligence is a very broad and encompassing term. And yes, a lot of people will use it to, to, I don't know, give Christianity a bit of a kick in the butt. But the reality is that most of what we know as demons from a Christian point of view were actually spirits and gods of previous cultures. And not all of them are great and friendly either. Like a lot of people just assume that like demonolatry is like Wicca, but with demons. That's not it at all. It's just that we don't automatically think demons are, evil and terrible. We look at them as they simply are. They do what they do. If what happens to us while working with them is bad or good, that's our perception of it. It's also a matter of how we take the lessons that we're given from the demonic. The demonic are lesson teachers. A lot of people will anthropomorphize divine intelligence and give it human attributes and assume that it is motivated similarly to humans, but that's not necessarily the case. Because people are always like, well, what do the demons get out of it? What do they get out of you worshiping them? Well, first of all, worship doesn't mean to grovel. Worship means to hold something in high regard and to respect it. So it's basically we are holding in high regard and respecting these forces of nature, these forces of the universe, these spirits behind different types of emotions and ideas and embodiments of different forces. And we're basically working with them in order to learn something about ourselves. And in doing that, we change the world around us, or at least our perception of the world, so that we can manifest our will here on Earth while we're here. So that's pretty much what demonolatry is. It's very encompassing, but it also means, because there's a lot of different demon types. I am one of those people that I venture to say that even angels are a type of demon because they're divine intelligence, right? So they're just a very high vibrating type of divine intelligence. Like divine intelligence comes in many different flavors. You've got planetary intelligences, or as I like to say, I tend to call them celestial intelligences, because we always, like everybody always says, like the moon and the sun are planets. Well, we know that the sun is a star and the moon is a satellite. So we can't really call them planetary, but we still do because that's what they did back in the day. So, and then you have the ones, and they vibrate higher and higher the further you go. As you get closer and closer, there's certain divine intelligences that vibrate closer to the sphere of the earth that we're on, like the jinn, like the Goetia, spirits of the Goetia. And then, of course, demons that you'll find like in the Ducante hierarchy. Those demonic forces tend to vibrate closer to the earth sphere. And then you also have your gods and goddesses of previous religions, and those tend to vibrate at a higher level. So that's the difference in them. And they don't always have to be nefarious or maleficent or anything like that, to where they're out to get you. But that's, so, I mean, there are a lot of people who are Satanists who are also demonolators, but not all demonolators are Satanists. And, but as far as like left-hand path, we're all left-hand path because we do believe that we are magicians. Magicians create. We are the makers of our own world. And we do that with the help of divine intelligence. And we are also divine because we are from that same source as the divine intelligence. And it kind of reminds me of Carl Sagan, who said, we are all made of star stuff. So like we're all connected in this universal cosmic web.
I love the way you put that. That's wonderful. So I counted on Amazon 53 books that you have published. Is that about right?
Yeah, for the demonolatry stuff, absolutely.
Yeah. So
I've been writing
how many total have you published?
um over 150. So like a lot of that's fiction too, because I write under all those different pen names. So I still like pursued my career as a fiction author. Like a lot of people think that, I just do demonolatry stuff, and that's, believe it or not, that's not the only thing I do. So but I do bring a lot of my demonolatry and magic and all of that into the fiction that I write too.
Well, I know the first book I bought was the complete book of Demonolatry, and
Yes.
it's been around for a long time. When was it first published?
It was first published, I want to say it was 2005 or 2006. Now, here's the thing about the complete book of demonolatry is it was initially modern demonolatry. Modern demonolatry I wrote back in 1999 because the demonolatry group I was with at that time actually needed some sort of pre-initiate text for their students. And we had like a really big group back then. We had like 75 people in that group. And so I wrote, so everyone was like, well, who's going to write it? And everyone's like, oh, Steph's the writer. And because I was going to college for writing at that time. And so I was like, well, okay, I'll give it a shot. So it is not my best. Clearly, modern demonolatry was not my best work. But then it went out of print because first of all, we had to find somebody who would like publish copies of it for us. And uh, we thought about like trying to get like a regular publisher for it, but that didn't really work out because, it was too dark and scary. So I had a friend who was publishing like just really awkward, weird books at the time. And so she published it. And it was even like hand bound and everything. Like she did all that, the binding and everything in her living room. And it turned out we ended up with a bunch of copies left over, and we offered them out to the general public just in case. And they sold just like that. And we were like, well, that's weird. But then we just never thought of it again. We were like, okay, we have our copies for our group. We're using them, blah, blah, blah. Down the road we go. Next thing I know, I'm getting phone calls at my house. I'm getting phone calls. My husband's like, what the heck's going on here? These people are calling, wondering where they can get copies of modern demonolatry. So apparently it had struck a chord with somebody. And, I always think like those publishers that were like, yeah, no, we're not interested, really missed out. They did, because that is by far one of my best-selling titles and has been for years. So when people kept bugging me, I was like, well, I don't have any way to publish these copies. And then somebody said, hey, have you seen Lulu, where you can go in and publish your own stuff and they'll take care of all the orders and everything for you. So just put the book back up there. So that's what I did. And then people were like, oh, but, we'd really like to see this expanded and all of this. And I was like, well, maybe I'll try my hand at it. So I just took modern demonolatry and added to it. That's all the complete book of demonolatry is. And it's actually in a revision right now for a second edition. I think we're doing a 20-year second edition, 20th anniversary. And we're going to do that in 2025, 2026. A new edition should come out.
I'll be looking forward to
it. Yeah. So, well, and we're taking a lot of stuff out because there's things like that I realized after the fact, like, I could have left some of this stuff completely out of the mix because it just there were so many people who were so angry about it. And like the whole, all the stuff about Richard de Conte, that was in there because the book was initially written for a certain group of people. I had no idea that it would go out and then everyone would expect me to produce like evidence that I couldn't produce, and that just it turned into a huge mess. So there's a lot of things that will be taken out of the second edition. It's just because they're just not relevant unless you are part of that particular book. So there's things like that there's a lot that needs to be fixed. There's a lot of consistency that needs to be put through the book because I also was working when I was doing demon definitions. I was working with books that I had access to at that time, which was not a lot. I mean, well, you probably wouldn't be amazed to know that the Denver Public Library and the college libraries and my local library do not have extensive resources on witchcraft. I mean, I have more at my fingertips now with the internet than I did back then. So when I go through, when we go through to revise, we're going to go through and I've got people like making sure that we're spelling Ashtaroth the same, everywhere, because sometimes it got switched with different, because there's different spellings. And that's because back in the day, grimoires were hand copied. So of course there were misspelling. It's how you get Gamagin versus Samagina in the Goetia. You'll find some of the manuscripts say Samagina and others say Gamagin. The same spirit. So there's that. You'll find that happens a lot in Goetia too. But of course, people don't like it when modern authors do that. You're not allowed. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes there. But we had no idea it would be that big of a book. So I put it out and it just kind of kept going. And I was like, maybe I should, because people would come to me. I ran that site Tesrian's Vault for years. And it was basically just a bunch of the stuff from modern demonolatry in website form. And of course, a lot of other websites took a lot from my website. So you'll find like a lot of Tesrian's Vault on websites like, oh gosh, I don't know. There's a few out there. There's a few out there that are still around that are still doing the same, still have the same information from my old websites, because I was back on the internet back in the mid 90s. So I was here when the internet came to be. And I've always been on the internet because of that. So that's exactly how that kind of came about and why it was written and how it became expanded and how my writing, I kind of fell into the line of work of writing demonolatry books to help people with their personal practice. So
why do you think it was so popular? I mean, it's a great book, but why do you think it took off like that?
Because like your other alternative was to your alternatives basically back then, the books available to you basically said either command demons and yell and scream at them and rage against everything demonic, or you had books that basically had you peeing on crucifixes and screaming hail Satan and screw Jesus or whatever. That was all you had. It was like this or this, and people were like, well, I don't like those two options. And a lot of people, I think, kind of probably discovered on their own that working with the demonic instead of against the demonic or trying to command and control them was getting them better results. And they were like, And so when the complete book of Demonolatry came out, it validated that for them. And they were like, oh yeah, this is more my speed. This is what I've been experiencing too. When I've been working with the demonic more respectfully, somebody actually gets me. There are more of us out there. We're not alone. Because I think that's it. Like, not everybody had the benefit of growing up accidentally, around a demonolatry coven. That's just not how that works. Most people end up being solitary. So I think it did. It validated a practice for a lot of people that they already knew existed or that they already felt in their heart. And I think it just, I don't know, it just resonated better than what was available.
So you have a new book, and as of yesterday, I'm pretty sure it's the same today. It's #1 on Amazon under demonolatry and Satanism. Can you tell us what's it called, and tell us a little bit about it, if you would?
Okay. It's called Psychic Self-Defense and Protection Magic for Demonolators. And it's basically, I wrote it because I've been getting so many emails, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, of people thinking that they've been cursed, that they have some sort of generational curse, they're being attacked, or they have some sort of attachment. And that seems to go in cycles because, I mean, like I've said, I've been on the internet for a long time. And back in the late 90s, like right before the turn of the century, there was a lot of this too. So I think it's when, like, the social situation and the world is kind of in turmoil. People start feeling like they're being attacked more, and they start thinking that they have attachments. And now sometimes this is true. Sometimes people are actually being attacked, and sometimes they do have an attachment. But I think the problem is we're now in a time when people learn most of what they use in their practice. They learn it from books. So they'll go through and they'll read books and they'll bring it in. But the problem is they have no foundation. They're not taught like people are in groups where you're taught foundation from the very beginning. So like one of the first things you learn, like in a coven type setting, is you learn meditation, you learn energy work. Those are the two big things, and you spend a lot of time on that. And then you learn how to do shielding, and you learn how to do banishings, and that's part of the energy work, and the meditation, because you need the meditation to be able to do, and the astral travel and all that, to be able to do some of the psychic self-defense work. So you learn those are the first three things you learn in most coven settings, right? So what happens then is, like, these people, they don't have that. And I was actually very negligent in my first books by not mentioning some of that to begin with, because I hadn't initially written the book as like a step by step how you would learn through a coven or a group. I was doing it more as like, this is Demonolatry 101. But there's like a whole foundational spread there that you have to learn before you go to the Demonolatry 101. And a lot of that's correspondences, because a lot of people they'll always say, well, which demons can I work with for this and this particular purpose, or which demons are water, and if you know that foundational correspondence, you know all that stuff. It's like all that stuff, once you start learning the 101 Demonolatry, you already have all that in place. So it makes a lot more sense. And if you learn all that first, any magical tradition you get into makes complete sense, which I have another book coming out in July that will cover some of that correspondence foundational stuff that's not Demonolatry specific. So I realized that I hadn't put out those books, because as a teacher, we're always looking for textbooks to help us help students. And we had one at one point that was like a correspondence book, and we've been using Dion Fortune's Psychic Self-Defense, but that's a bit dry reading. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read some of those books or not, but we decided that we needed one for Demonolatry badly, and so I wrote it, and that's why, because I kept getting all these. I had to keep repeating myself in emails saying, okay, so here's what you do, this is how you do shielding. This is how you do a dispel negativity. This is how you do a banishment. And we don't preach banishment in Demonolatry because we were taught from the very beginning. Again, I have these blinds in my head that I don't realize until like one of my editors is like, what the hell are you talking about here? Because I learned these things early on, where you learn that that banishment is just one of those things. Like in other traditions, they banish before and after every ritual. And I never really kind of understood why they did that, but it is because like some people need it, but not everyone does. That's the thing. So you need some people need banishment always. Some people need banishment sometimes. And some people need banishment, when they remember to do it, or at least twice a year, whether they need it or not. That's it. And so I thought I would actually write a book about that. And not only, it also covers like there are symptoms of attachments and curses and all of that, that could be attributed to mental health issues and physiological issues that could be very serious. So it was important to point that out too. And I don't think a lot of magic books do that. They just go with the woo woo, and they don't stop to bring the practitioner down to earth and say, okay, now it's great that, all this woo woo is out here and you think you're cursed or whatever, but honestly, could you be having a bad day? Are you depressed? Are you having an anxiety attack? Are you just anxious? Do you have ADHD? Do you have something else like a bipolar disorder that could, if unchecked and not taken care of properly, could that actually be causing your symptoms? Or could it be something more serious? I actually have had people in the past. There was one guy who ended up having a brain tumor. And so he was having all of these symptoms that felt to him like an attachment or a curse. And I finally convinced him to go to his doctor. And he explained the symptoms to his doctor and everything. And they did like scans and everything. And they found a brain tumor. And he wrote back and was like, oh, thank goodness I went to the doctor, because here I was thinking it was a spiritual thing, and it was physiological. Another woman thought she was being raped and molested by demons. And I was like, okay, come on, you really need to get checked out by a doctor, because this isn't normal, and it's very, very rare for actual symptoms like that. She ended up finding out she had an eating disorder, which she didn't tell me about. Of course, people don't ever tell you. She had severely low vitamin B. It was dangerously low. And it was actually giving her symptoms of feeling like something was sexually molesting her. She was able to get the vitamin B deficiency fixed. And thank goodness for that, because the doctor said that it could have killed her. So sometimes what you think is a spiritual problem is not a spiritual problem. It's a physical or a mental problem that can be fixed if you're getting the right professional help for it. But, and this is what I always say, because a lot of people will come in and they'll be like, okay, so I've done all of these things and nothing's working magically. Well, if it's not working magically and all of the spiritual stuff you're trying isn't working, it's not a spiritual problem. That's the problem. You also have a lot of people who are very histrionic. They're just total drama queens. They love the attention. They thrive on it. So they make up this stuff, and so they can just have the swirl of drama around them and get all of this attention. And so there is some attention-seeking disorders that can cause, or rather that it's symptomatic of people pretending to be possessed or attacked, or and that's a real problem too. So you really need to know what you're working with. And sometimes if somebody's delusional and you pander to those delusions of them being possessed, it can make them worse and put them closer to a psychotic break. So you have to be super careful. Like, people get mad because they'll come to me wanting me to do an exorcism. And I'm like, okay, well, I need all of these things first. And they get angry because I won't just automatically do the exorcism. It's like, well, because I want to make sure you're safe. I want to make sure you're healthy. And I have your best interests at heart. I don't want to just do an exorcism for no reason and then you still be sick afterwards. And if someone is still sick afterwards, it's a bigger problem. And it's a scarier problem. I think that's why people jump to the supernatural first, and then physiological and psychological stuff second, because that's the scarier stuff, right? It's a lot more terrifying to think, oh, I might have a brain tumor or something medically wrong with me, or that I could be having some sort of psychosis, than it is to say, oh, the spirit world is messing with me or someone's cursing me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very good point that a lot of people don't think about. Is it could be something physical. It could be something medically wrong with them.
Right.
It's a very good point. Very good point. And obviously being in groups, that brings its own kind of drama as well. Some people are just, they want the attention. They want to be recognized. And so, yeah, that's a very good point that you make.
Right. Well, I mean, after so many years of working in groups of people and working with people, that's just something I noticed. Like the actual attachments and curses are actually a teeny tiny legitimate cases, teeny tiny number of legitimate cases compared to the number of people who think they're actually cursed, or a lot of people bring it on themselves, or they create self-created thought forms of negativity, and they're actually hurting themselves because they believe that they're cursed, or they believe they have an attachment, not realizing that they've created that attachment themselves. So that's another issue.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. Yeah, it feeds
Absolutely.
right into that. So I found an interesting interview that you did on the cult of you. It was called Demonic Within, and it was a very good interview. You mentioned that in your younger days you had some experiences in the established church because of some of your relatives. Could you explain some of those for our viewers?
Well, so here's the thing. I was actually baptized Catholic. My parents were ostracized from the church because my mom was a Lutheran, and she was going to convert, but something happened and there was a kerfluffle because she used to teach Sunday school, apparently. This was like before I remember much anyway. I was very, very, like, probably an infant at the time. And so I was baptized Catholic, but I was not made to go through confirmation or anything like that because my parents were out of the church at that point. And my dad is one of those people who's like, he's Catholic by tradition, but not really by belief. So he was always kind of like one of those, kind of an atheist, really, if you think about it. Or if he does have a belief in God, it's more of an agnostic thing. And my mother, being raised Lutheran, a lot of her family are like different types of evangelical Christianity. And so my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, used to take me to the Catholic Church with her. And I always found it fascinating because it was the ritual aspect of it. I always loved the ritual aspect of it. I mean, the rest of it just, at that age, because I was like really little. I think the last time I went to a Catholic church when I was little. I mean, I've been since because I've gone to friends' weddings and I've gone to funerals and stuff like that were Catholic. So, I've been to a Catholic church since then. But when I was little, like the last time I went with my grandmother, I was probably about 8, and she tried to send me into like the pre-confirmation class one day to go sit with the other kids and talk to the priest. And I remember I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. I was very young. I walked into the room and the guy like had me come up front and he did the whole cross thing over my face, and I ran from the room screaming. And I didn't think, it wasn't like it burned or anything, but I was just like, yeah, I don't want to do this. And I was also a very shy kid. I didn't want to, I didn't really want to be made the center of attention ever. And that was kind of what he was doing, was basically making me the center of attention. I just think it's interesting that was my reaction. And I don't even know why I had that reaction, just screaming and running from the room. But I do know my grandmother was so embarrassed, she never took me to church again. So,
I can imagine.
That was one of my experiences with Catholicism anyway. But my aunt was evangelical, and they were always moving church to church. And those people were freaking crazy. I mean, not all of them. I guess, I don't know. I mean, I have friends who are Christian who just aren't like crazy Christian, but like these people were crazy Christian. And my aunt would convince my mother to send us to this thing called Vacation Bible School. So we'd have to go for a week and like listen to like all the Bible stories, and then at the end like everyone, they would want you to come up and like declare your love for Jesus. And I remember the last time that I went, I was 8 years old. My aunt was pushing me up the aisle of the church to go declare that I'd been saved by Jesus. And I was like fighting back. I'm like, oh no, I'm not going up there. Because again, forcing me to be the center of attention. I've never really liked that. So I finally got up there and, did what she wanted me to do just to get her off my back. But I was like, yeah, no, we're not doing this anymore. I went home and I told my mother, I said, I don't want to go back again. So the next year when my aunt's like, oh, I'll take the kids to vacation Bible school, I told my mother, I said, I'm not going. So don't even think about sending me. I am not going. We're not doing that again. It was terrifying. But I mean, really, the only thing I really remember from that experience was that particular experience with my aunt pushing me to go up and declare I was saved by Jesus, and the cookies and juice. That's like all I remember from that experience. Like nothing else.
The cookies
so, like,
and juice.
Forced indoctrination. Yeah, it just never worked for me. So I always had issues with that. Like, and of course, my mom and my aunt would always have these like long, drawn out discussions, because my aunt was like very much like God centric. Like her life was all about Jesus, the whole 9 yards, and that's like all she talked about most of the time. And yet she also like read Stephen King, so she was like she loved horror novels, which so it's so weird.
That's quite a spectrum.
Right? Yeah, I know, right? So it was just, she was just interesting. I don't know. But yeah, so like my view of religion has always been like, what the hell is this shit? Like, why are they trying to make me do anything? Which is why another reason like demonolatry is very appealing, I think, to a lot of people too, is because there is, I mean, yeah, okay, you get into an established group, and yeah, like while you're in that group or while you're doing ritual with that group, excuse me, while you're in that group and while you're doing ritual with that group, yeah, you're working within a defined spectrum of beliefs and what you're doing. But outside of that group, you're still solitary. You can still do whatever you want. And even if you bring what you're doing outside of the group into the group, like people don't get mad and go, that's not how you do it. That's, you know what I'm saying? There's not that dogma, or there's not that, condemnation if you don't do things, everybody else's way. As a matter of fact, when you go to a demonolatry group, like, because most of the time for like demonolatry groups, it's for socialization, or it's for some sort of liturgical rite, to where you're like just basically honoring a demonic force. You're not really doing a lot of group magic, because magic is a very solitary thing. We still view magic as a very solitary thing. I mean, the only time I really promote group magic is if everybody's on the same page and wants to get the same thing accomplished. Because it can be effective in that sense, or having a magical partner or whatever. But beyond that, it's mostly like socialization and worship. And that's about it. So when you go into those group settings, you're telling people what you're working on magically. They like give you ideas and you get feedback, and you can bounce ideas off of each other. And generally, not always, nobody's going to go, that's not how you do it. Because it leaves a lot of room for the individuality of the person, because no two people are alike, so no two spiritualities are really alike. What each of us needs at a different time is a different thing, where some people might need, a little more financial magic or whatever. Other people might need a little more love magic, or, friendship magic or whatever. So when you're working, on that, like, and at different times of your life, different things are going to be important to you. So while you're young, it may be, success and material things. As you get older, it may be health and family things.
So you also spoke during that interview about around age 16, getting rid of the Christian. What was your process in doing that?
Well, like I mentioned, I think just reading Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, for a while there, I even thought I might have been an atheistic Satanist for a few months there, at least, where I thought, well, this makes complete sense. It just basically, there was something about the book that just resonated with me at that time. It's kind of like the right book at the right time. And it just completely shattered my view of established religion and or socially acceptable religion. Just completely shattered it. And I was like, this is absolutely right. Why the hell I'm stuck in this Christian culture? I mean, we all are. We can't really get away from it regardless. Our culture is still very much Christian. Excuse me. And I don't know. It just hit me. And then like I said, for a couple months there, I felt like I was a bit more atheistic. And after a couple of months of really pounding that atheistic pulpit in my brain, I was like, well, yeah, but I can't believe that because here I am. I've been able to see and speak with spirits. So how do I reconcile these two things? And I couldn't. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to shove the atheist stuff back in the closet because that ain't going to work for me. And I'm going to have to just stick with being a theist because, but at the same time, like literally, I don't even know exactly what part it was. I think it might have been, the anecdotal experiences of Anton LaVey saying that he was like, he would see people who had just been to church, coming in and drinking and boozing and whoring and all of those things when he was allegedly working at a circus or whatever, and which we all know now to be false. But at the same time, it was a great anecdote,
Now you spoke about facing your fears in Magick. What do you think is the most important or the most effective way of doing that?
Well, interestingly, what we fear, I think, changes as we age. Like, when you're young, you like fear maybe losing your social group. Maybe you're afraid of snakes or something like that. I don't know. But I think at least acknowledging that you have the fear and then facing it makes you stronger and teaches you how to cope and teaches you skills of how to deal with things when you're deathly afraid of them. One of those, a lot of things that people are afraid of tend to center around things like change, fear of the loss of people you care about, fear of the loss of your social group, fear of being unemployed, fear of being homeless, fear of being without food. These are all different types of fears that you may have at different times in your life. You may have a fear of success or a fear of failure or a fear of not measuring up or being good enough for other people. And at some point, we're kind of forced to face those fears, especially when you're working magic and you're working with the demonic, because the demons are lesson teachers. And if they find something that you're afraid of, they will force you to face that fear, whether you like it or not. And I'll give you a great example of this. I had been doing some Sorath work. This was probably back in about 2017, 2018. And I was working with my new Sorath model. And it was new at the time anyway. And I was like, I want to take my fiction writing career to the next level. And when you're working with Sorath, you're basically asking Sorath to bring the light of the sun onto you. So you're like, put me in the spotlight, basically. And while I was actually doing that work, I kept getting forced into these public speaking engagements. I suck at public speaking. Let's be honest. There was a time, like back in 2005, that when I first got my first novel published, I had to do a public speaking thing, and I froze in the middle of it and was just like, everything just went out of my brain, and I was just standing there in front of a room full of like 30 people, and I was like, in my brain, I was like, oh crap, what am I going to do? Luckily, a friend was there with me. She jumped in, and I was like, oh, okay. So it gave me a moment to like recollect myself and move forward. But it was a paralyzing fear. So basically what the demonic was telling me by throwing all these public speaking engagements at me was like, okay, first of all, you need to learn how to do public speaking. If you want the type of success in your career that you're asking for, you need to be able to manage this. And if you can't, then maybe you're in over your head and you're out of your depth here. So they just kept throwing sorceress just kept throwing those at me over and over and over again. And it worked because I am actually more comfortable public speaking now than I ever have been. And I teach classes and stuff all the time in front of huge groups of people. Had to give like a speech in front of like 300 people, just stuff like that I've had to do in the last, since 2017, 2018. That has really helped me. But it was about facing that fear of making an ass out of myself in front of people. It's like, you know what? If I make an ass out of myself, I guess I do. I mean, what can you do? Right.
Right.
So yeah, so that's where fear facing comes in. And that's a big part of the self work, and the shadow work, as everyone calls it. Shadow work is just self work. It's just that you're facing the darker aspects of yourself. Because once you're able to control yourself and control your fears and control your emotions and choose your reactions to things, the easier it is to create the life you want and to navigate things. And that's what Magick's all about, though, isn't it? Right? To cause change in conformity with your will. And to do that, you do have to be able to navigate a lot of internal stuff.
Good point. Good point. So, why do you think it's important for a person to take responsibility and accountability for their path?
That is like a really good question. And I think that's a big part of the left-hand path, because the left-hand path, again, is where you are taking control. Life isn't happening to you, you're happening to life. And that's the big difference right there. And so in order to do that, you do have to take responsibility. You have to own what you do. So if you curse somebody and they die, you have to accept that that's a thing that you did. And you have to accept the consequences internally for that. You know what I'm saying? Like, because for some people, they'll do magic and something like that will happen. They'll be like, oh, I'm going to curse this person. They curse the person, they die. And then they're just ridden with guilt. And they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to do that. It's like, well, no, but you need to, before you even open the spell book, before you even, conjure the demonic force that you're working with, you need to know that is a possibility, that you could, if you're going to curse someone, you could actually kill them. And you need to be able to accept the consequences for that emotionally and mentally. If that person dies, are you really going to be fine with it? Because it's all great and fine in theory, right? Like, oh, that person, they really made me angry. Because oftentimes, if you are that angry enough to curse somebody to where they die, then you at one point probably love that person. Because they're like, they say a fine line between love and hate. I think that in order for a curse to be that effective, you really have to have cared about someone at some point. So that can bring a lot of unexpected feelings with it. And so that's just one example of, a consequence of your actions. And if you refuse to take responsibility for yourself, then it's a lot harder to grow and change and maneuver life in the direction you want it to go. Because, people who, for example, you go to work and you blame all of your mistakes on somebody else, you're probably going to get fired. You're not going to get promoted. But even if no matter how much magic you're working to get promoted, if you're not taking responsibility for your fuck ups and learning from them, you are probably going to get fired, and you're not going to get what you want, no matter how much magic you throw at it. So, and that's probably a lesson from the demonic when that happens. Like, hey, you want these things, but you're not willing to play the game and own up to your mistakes and try to make them right. So there's a lot of that too. So I think that's a big part of the left-hand path, because it's controlling your destiny. And how can you control your destiny if you're in denial of your own faults and your own mistakes and the things that are actually your fault? Like, some people will be like, oh, we'll go back to like the whole being cursed thing. Oh, I'm cursed, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you're just making really, really bad decisions. And they're bad decisions because people have told you they're bad decisions, but you're in denial about that. You need to look at yourself and be honest with yourself, because ultimately, you can lie to everybody else, but you cannot lie to yourself, and you can't lie to the demonic divine. They'll know.
That's a good point. I think a lot of people want to blame their shortcomings, or they want to blame their lack of work for something. They just want it to be handed to them. So that's a very good point that you make. Do you have any favorite demons that you like to work with?
Well, it depends. Like, I have favorite demons for different things. Some of my go-tos, though, tend to be Leviathan, who is my patron. Um, we just work well together, and he's helped me through a lot of stuff. So, and then of course there's Lucifuge. I've always had a connection with Lucifuge. Don't know why. Sometimes you just have a connection and you don't know why. It's just maybe it's the diplomacy, the warnings he'll give me when there's like something that I need to be aware of. But we've always kind of had like this connection. And Lucifer also tends to come to me when I'm doing readings for other people. So he's kind of like a spirit guide in that sense. And kind of helps me out with that. So there are quite a few, and it really depends. Like, for example, when it comes to healing, it depends on the type of healing. Like, if you're sick or have a cold or something like that, Marbas can be really great. If you have, a broken bone or something like that, you can look at Vepr. If you need some emotional healing, Paimon or Buer. So it really depends on the demonic force, and like the actual purpose. But yeah, I do have some favorites. Like, I think everybody ultimately ends up, no matter what hierarchy you work with, you end up with a certain set of go-to demons that you'll work with for specific things, because you've built such a relationship with them over time that you'll specifically, like, that's the demon you go to for this one thing.
Right. I like your comment that you made during that interview about magic being almost like alchemy in itself, an alchemical process. What did you mean by that?
Generally, alchemy is meant to, like, bring things to like their pure form, or to transform something into something else. So a lot of what you do in magic is to transform. You're transforming yourself. You're molding yourself into another person. Well, not really another person, but the person you want to be. You're molding your life into the life that you want. You are turning yourself from maybe one thing to another. Like, maybe you're not successful, but you want to turn yourself into someone who is successful. And also, when you look at it that way, like, when you're actually mixing all of the elements of magic, it's like some sort of alchemical synthesis of, like, let's say, excuse me, let's say you're having you're recovering from some sort of deep emotional trauma. And when you're working magic, you might bring in some water demons like Paimon or Leviathan. And you may also bring in something that's comforting to you. And you'll bring in all of these different aspects that work, let's just say, like, if you worked with Paimon, for example, exclusively, that's one particular energy. But as you add all of these different things, it changes the energy to more specifically target what you're doing, if that makes sense.
It
So
does.
if you're using, yeah, so like if you're working on sort of like some sort of sexual trauma, for example, you can work with Paimon, but maybe you bring in some fiery aspects and bring in Citri or Lilith in there, to kind of address that sexual issue that you're having. And so you can kind of tweak it, and it alchemically changes the energy that you're working with. So each thing that you add to that magical work changes the energy that you're applying toward the situation. And you can refine it to the point to where you actually can excise that one thing that you need to work on and try to overcome it or work through it. Because sometimes the only way only way to get through something is to go through it. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to try to go around it or ignore it and pretend it's not there. But you can also do this with yourself. Like you can slowly bring in different aspects of demonic energy into yourself. Like let's say you want to be more outgoing and you want to, have a better social life. So you work with Astaroth and kind of draw that energy into yourself so that you have a little bit more of that um, fiery friendship making, outgoing, extroverted type energy. If you're an introvert, you know what I'm saying? So it really is about refining and drawing something out of yourself or implementing something in yourself and changing yourself alchemically in order to get the desired result.
I have faced public attacks along the left-hand path. Have you faced attacks like that?
I have. I mean, if you're talking about, I don't get a lot of attacks from Christians. I think demonolatry is too big of a word for a lot of them, so they don't know what it is. they don't bother to look it up. So they're just like they pretty much leave me alone. I am mostly attacked by other practitioners, and it happens all the time. Like I'll have people like hurry up into my inbox going, "Oh, Steph, you're never gonna guess so and so's like talking about you again and saying all sorts of horrible things about you." I'm like, oh, apparently something I did or said triggered them and made them feel insecure about themselves. That's kind of how I look at it, though. It's like I don't engage people who attack just because I know that it's more about them than it is actually about me. And oftentimes you're going to find that that is the case. When someone's attacking you, it really is more about them than it is about you. You've triggered something in them that's triggered jealousy, envy, or anger somehow. And ultimately, the root of it is usually because they're insecure about something. Really, what it comes down to is you've triggered something in them that's really upset them and made them feel attacked in some way. Like they feel like they have to defend themselves. And so a lot of times when people try to defend themselves, they immediately just a barrage of insults, of things that aren't true. There was a certain very well-known magician, we won't name names, who was really, really angry that Demonolatry uses blood magic. And he ran around telling everyone, this is BS. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's just a wannabe, blah, blah, blah. If you feed demons blood, they're going to want more and more and more until you kill yourself and die. So I did actually respond to this. I was like, well, and I didn't respond directly to him. I was like, because he was just like screaming this all over the web. And people were coming to me in my inbox going, oh my God, did you see what he said? And I was like, here's the thing. It's like, I've been, and this was like, I don't know, quite a few years ago. I was like, I've been doing this for 35 years or whatever, however long it had been at that time. And I haven't killed myself yet. So, and I've been practicing blood magic since I was at least 14 years old. So even before I was into Demonolatry, I was practicing some blood magic. So, yeah, no, so sometimes I'll address things like that, but I won't address the person directly and I won't call them out on it because it's like, that's what they want. They want to start a fight a lot of times. Sometimes they start a fight because they want the attention. I've had entire groups dedicated to my downfall, like where they are just like an I hate Steph club, and they'll go like onto Amazon, onto all my books and write the nastiest reviews they can and tell everybody to not read my books, that they're terrible. And it's like they literally, that's their hobby, is to try to destroy me, I think. Some of them, not all of them. They get bored after a while, but they eventually go away because they're not getting a reaction out of me. And I think that's a big part of it too, is when people attack other people, it's because they don't have anything going on in their lives. So they spend all their time minding everyone else's business and not minding their own, which, is problematic for them, certainly. But really, again, it says a lot more about them and the lack of fulfillment and contentment in their own lives than it actually says about the person that they're attacking. So that's kind of how I deal with it. I just kind of, yeah, well, whatever. Yeah, I know I'm a horrible person. Although I did have to recently address the fact that I am not a Nazi. Somehow, some rumor, probably from my hater club, got started that I'm like involved with white supremacists and that I was married, that my boyfriend is a Nazi. I'm like, I've been married since 2001 to the same guy, and he's more liberal than I am. And I'm, I mean, I'm kind of a centrist, but I lean liberal. He's much more liberal than I am. So really not a Nazi. And so that was an interesting, crazy, crazy idea. So it's weird the things you hear about yourself. Have you ever heard the rumors about? Have you heard rumors about yourself? Like somebody doesn't know who you are, and then you walk into a room, or I say a room, but like into an internet chat, and you see all these people talking about you, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well, I know their publicist, and they're just a fraud, blah blah blah." And I'm like, "I have a publicist? Damn, I'm doing really good. I didn't know I had a publicist." Um, just crazy stuff like that. Or one young girl who's like 20 something, 21, 22, was running around telling everyone, I met her at a party in Colorado Springs, and she's dull and stupid and the dumbest person I've ever talked to. And I'm like, I didn't know I had gone to a party in Colorado Springs. When was this? There was another guy who was like, I know him and his wife, and they're terrible people. So apparently I'm a man. In a lot of these stories, I'm a man. In another story, I was oh gosh, I don't know. There's just been so many crazy things, so many crazy stories these people just make up about me, that like, oh, they never heard of me back in the 90s. They were like big in the occult scene in the 90s, and they never heard of me. And I'm like, oh, so you knew all of the occult scene in all of freaking Denver and all the outlying suburbs? So, and you're just like, what is wrong with you people? So it's
Yeah.
amazing what people will do or say just to try to make them sound better so their opinion of you sticks. And it's crazy. Yeah, I deal with that all the time.
Yeah.
So most of the time I just don't acknowledge. I just laugh. And then like, talk about it with my friends. So like, oh yeah, did you know that I allegedly did this week? They're like, oh man.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I've got my fair share of those as well. And they always speak from a position of authority. They're going to out me about this, that, and the other, and they don't know me at all.
right.
It really is funny. I know that I've got a lot of influences when it comes to writing, you being one of them. What writers have influenced you?
Well, I suppose it depends on the genre. Um, but I really for like fiction, I was always a big Dana Reed and Stephen King fan, and Dean Koontz and Anne Rice, and a lot of those authors. So anything with a more supernatural bend. I also was like a big fan of David Eddings. So those are my influences. And I have some others, like, for romance, I have a few. Charisse Sinclair was a big one that influenced some of my work in the romance genre anyway. Um, but like in the occult world, I would have to say like writers that you probably wouldn't expect, like Lon Milo Duquette. I am like such a fangirl, and I'm not even a Thelemite. That's not Philema's not even my thing. Um, but I just love his books. His books are absolutely amazing, and I am also a big fan of Paul Hewson, and I really enjoyed Steve Savedow. Um, and you wouldn't realize it because Demonolatry is so far removed from ceremonial magic, but David Rankine and Stephen Skinner have some wonderful work. Now those are more recent influences, but back before I really got going with the writing, it was definitely like Lon Milo Duquette and Paul Hewson and just obscure authors like that. So, well, not obscure. I guess Lon Milo Duquette isn't obscure, but Paul Hewson kind of is. don't know that he did many others other than mastering witchcraft. But yeah, that's, I mean, I also enjoyed some of the witchy writers out there. Lori Cabot, she was always a good writer. I always enjoyed her stuff because it was very, very kind of hermetic, so it had that bend to it. That was nice. You know,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
probably it. Oh,
Great
Valerie Worth
list.
is good too.
Yeah.
As far as like
Absolutely.
traditional witchcraft, Valerie Worth. So
Hmm.
yeah, I wasn't really influenced by it necessarily. Well, because when I started writing, Demonolatry books, there wasn't a lot out there. Like, now you've got like everybody from E.A. Coetting, and you've got just like this whole bunch of writers. You've got all the Luciferian writers like Michael Ford and Bill Dubendak and Aseneth Mason and all of these other people that, you've got a lot of really great writers now in Left Hand Path, whether it's Luciferianism or Satanism. And, I didn't have that when I started out. So like my influences were like traditional witchcraft and Thelema. So
You spoke about blood magic. How important is blood magic in ritual?
a lot of people misunderstand blood magic. They think you're actually like paying the demon. They think that you're giving blood to pay the demon. But there's a psychological aspect to blood magic that people don't often realize. The whole point of blood magic and the whole point of giving a drop or two of your own blood for what you want is to prove that you are willing to make sacred and to endure that tiny bit of pain, the pinprick of pain, for what you want. It's basically a declaration that you are serious and that you are taking it seriously and that you are committed and dedicated to making this happen, whatever it is that you're doing. So that's why I practice blood magic, is because I believe that if you're willing to shed, because your blood is sacred, your life force is sacred, your life is sacred. If you're willing to willing to let go of a couple of drops of your own blood for what you want, then you're basically kind of making I want to say like a pact with yourself. It's like, even with demonic pacts, you're making a pact more with you than you are with the demon. The demon's just there to hold you accountable, to help you hold you accountable to what you're actually proposing, to the change you're proposing to make in your life. So that's kind of how I view the whole pact situation as well.
How do you think the left hand path is going to change in the future? How do you think it's going to evolve?
It's interesting because I've actually seen like the evolution of demonolatry from a very closed practice with a very specific set of way of doing things that you kind of, I mean, even though it's still like you can still draw other things into your personal practice, like from a group setting where everything has like a specific setup, the rituals have like a particular outline to them. This happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's interesting because I've kind of seen demonolatry evolve from what I knew it as to something that can sometimes be not even recognizable to me because it's so vastly different from how I practice. So I honestly have no idea where it's going to end up or how it's going to change in the future. But I'm sure it's going to be really interesting. And I think the most important thing is that it works for people and helps them become better people and helps them live better lives. Because ultimately, I think that's what magic is for. It's to help evolve us, not just in consciousness or the way we think, or as physical beings, or as spiritual beings stuck in a physical body, however you want to look at that. But as long as it's helping people and it's not binding them or oppressing them in any way, I think it would be a good thing. And I don't know that it could change to a point to where people are feeling oppressed by their own belief system. Because there are like some groups, you know, you get into and they're very cultish, like, oh, you have to believe this, and if you don't, you're out. And then there's groups that are like, you know, this is kind of generally what the people in the group believe, but you know, if you got a different belief, we're cool with that.
So for someone that's new to the left-hand path, what advice would you have for them?
I would say the advice I have for people who are new to the left-hand path is to explore all the different paths and realize that you don't have to fit into one specific mold. Look at books as like collections of ideas. They're not gospel. I don't believe they are anyway. I don't write my books to be read as gospel or used as the gospel. I want people to take the stuff I write and modify it to a way that fits them, or take what works for them and leave everything else. For some people, my books will be completely worthless for them. They will not find any value in them whatsoever, and that's fine. I didn't write my books for those people. I wrote the books for the people that it would actually help. And I've always said that people should kind of build their own spiritual path. So my advice is to read as much as you can, read across. That's one of the reasons I never attack other authors, is because all of us have a place. All of my readers still read all of the other authors. And that's kind of the beauty of it. It's not like we're competing for readers, because the readers are reading everything. They're going to look into every author that they can find. And I think that people should do that. I think they should buy a foundational book from every author that they can find in the left-hand path and read through it, see what they agree with, see what they don't, make notes, learn what they can about the basic foundational structure of all of Western magic. And now it's not always the same. Like, you know, sometimes the elemental directions change from, say, you know, traditional witchcraft to Kemetic practice to more traditional ceremonial magic. So like all that stuff's going to change, but there's still that basic foundational layer there that people, I think, should learn, because it's going to help them. It's going to help them learn, go through all of the different magical traditions available to them and understand them better, and more easily find what they agree with and what they don't, and what works for them and what doesn't.
Great advice. Is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with? Any particular message?
I don't know that I have a particular message for them, except that don't let other people try to pigeonhole you and tell you what you can and can't do. Magicians create. If you need to create something new to make something happen, do it. Don't be afraid to experiment. And if you do decide to do something outside the book, and you want to try using, you know, a yellow candle instead of a black one or whatever, do it. Because the only way you're going to learn is through experimentation, and the world isn't going to end. I promise you. I've been pushing that explode button since 1984, and I'm still here.
I love that. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It has
Thank you for having me.
It's been a blessing for me, and I know it will be for our viewers as well. So,
well, thank you.
And for those of you at home, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this has been Alistair Noct. Ave Satanas.